He didn't use a passcode, not because he trusted people, because he never imagined anyone would dare. I was just a coworker. I saw the notification flash before the screen went dark. Can't wait Saturday. For 14 months, I watched my boss build a second life right next to the first one. The whispers, the client dinners, the phone calls I pretended not to hear. His wife was 7 months pregnant, and he was planning an $18,000 rooftop party for someone else's 30th birthday. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself 3 times, but there's a moment when silence stops being neutral and starts being complicity. So I made one phone call, I slipped one envelope, and I made sure she could walk through that door. What happened next on that rooftop changed everything. Not just for her, for every person in that room who thought they knew which woman held the power. The quietest person in the room is often the one who's been paying the most attention and the one you should never, ever underestimate. This story is about what happens when a woman stops making herself small and the world finally sees her full size. If you've ever been overlooked by someone who should have known better, drop a single word in the comments. Just one word. I'll read every single one. And if this hit you somewhere real, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe because the next story is already waiting for you.
It all started with music for her. For me, it was a look, not a suspicious message or some cheap cliche. It was the title of a life lived in secret, Cass Summer, and I saw it unfold over 47 excuses. I remember he hated that bistro. It was a Tuesday in August, and Margot was 7 months along. I imagine her standing in her kitchen, one hand on her back, the other on a glass of water, feeling the morning light and thinking it was hope. For me, that same light felt like an interrogation lamp, exposing a truth I didn't want to see. I wanted to look away, to pretend it was my mistake, that I was seeing things. My mind screamed at me, "Don't look, Leo. Don't get involved." I saw him unlock his phone. No passcode, not out of trust, but because he never imagined anyone would dare to question him. Then I saw a notification pop up before the screen went dark. Can't wait Saturday. I went back to my desk, my throat dry. I wanted to undo it, to unsee it. 3 times I told myself to forget it, lock it away, but I couldn't. I had to know. I didn't need to read a thread on a phone. I overheard the whole affair in the open plan office. For 14 months, it was a slow burn of whispers and casual lies. I pieced together a second life he was living right beside the one we all saw. The details weren't sordid, which was worse. They were intimate. Nicknames, private jokes, photos from dinners at places Margot wanted to go, but he was always too busy for. I heard without listening. I saw without looking. Then, the big one, the planning for the Rosewood rooftop party. A private buyout for 50 guests. The Krug champagne. He was on the phone, laughing. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, repeating her words. "You only turned 30 once," he answered. "You deserve the world." I looked at the picture of him and Margot on his desk. She was 7 months pregnant with his child, and he was planning a universe for someone else. I didn't feel anger then, just a profound coldness. My mind started running a million scenarios, quiet and fast, like a computer trying to solve an impossible problem, processing a truth it was never meant to handle. I didn't take pictures or write anything down. I just tried to go back to my desk and pretend I saw nothing, that my world hadn't just tilted on its axis. I saw him later, getting a yogurt from the office fridge, peeling back the foil and eating it by the window, looking out over the city, a city he moved through with confidence, a city he could afford because of her. Though I didn't know it then, that thought just hung there. The money, her money, was something he wore like his own suit. I was raised to believe your character should be the most impressive thing about you. His was a hollow frame. His character at that moment was a man eating free office yogurt, while his marriage was a ticking bomb. I didn't text anyone. I didn't call anyone. I finished my coffee, washed the mug, and put it on the rack because that's what you do. You perform the normal things when your understanding of the world is falling apart. When he came back to his desk at 7:45, his tie was perfect. He was ready for the day. I imagine he called home, kissed her through the phone, the way you do with someone who has become a concept, an affectionate and distant habit. Then he hung up. I shut my laptop. For a long time, the only sounds were the server fans and a siren in the distance. I let those sounds be normal. Then I opened my own phone and I started digging. I found it 2 days later, an email. Margot, it read, prenup. I knew her lawyer's name was Russell. I knew I had to pull the thread. I needed the full picture. A part of me hesitated. I could hear a voice asking, should you really do this? Not yet, I thought, but soon. I forwarded it from an anonymous account. I pressed my hand against my desk, my heart pounding. It felt like I was helping her announce herself, helping her practice for the fight to come. I pictured her saying the words, not out loud, but in that quiet place, inside where resolve is forged. Whatever happens, I've got you. The office light still felt too bright, but something was different. It felt like the start of something, not the end. It was the strange calm of a man who has finally chosen a side and realized the ground was there to stand on all along. Derek never knew the truth about her, not really. He had his reasons for not looking deeper, I guess. But sitting there, with a forwarded email and a secret that felt bigger than my whole career, I started to see it. The quietness she used to protect herself was about to become her sharpest weapon. I'd known Margot through Derek for almost 2 years. In that time, I'd learned 2 things about her. She was smarter than she let on, and she never showed her cards. When I saw her pulling up to a friend's house that Tuesday, I knew something had finally broken. I made myself another coffee. The good stuff I hide from my roommate. The kind you save for real emergencies. The kind that requires a choice. I saw her get out of the car. She looked like she hadn't slept, her hair tied back with a pin. She was 7 months pregnant, and she was walking into a war. The way she moved felt heavy, like a choice had been made, and she was hauling its consequence. Sitting at my kitchen table, she laid it all out. The hidden phone, the playlist, the messages, the party. I listened with that hard silence I use when I'm fighting every impulse to scream for a friend. My jaw ached from clenching. My coffee sat cold. It's what I do when a situation demands my complete focus and my complete self-restraint. When she finished, I just said, okay. How are you holding up? I'm fine, she lied. No, you're not. No, she admitted. But I'm functional, and right now that's what counts. I could feel the words she didn't say, the ones I'd been ignoring for years. I knew something was wrong, deep down. I always blamed it on hormones, or stress, or just Derek's moody nature that she married into. I knew, and my silence now feels like a betrayal. I knew enough to get that her childhood was different from mine. There was that estate somewhere in Connecticut, and her dad, Theo Ellison, came from what I'd gently call very old money. But Margot drove a normal car, wore clothes you'd find at the mall, and worked as an art consultant because she truly had a passion for it. It was a quiet kind of wealth, the kind that didn't need to shout. What I didn't grasp was the sheer scale of it. Why a man like Russell Hart, with 3 law degrees and a portfolio spanning 6 continents, would take her call before 8 in the morning. She didn't tell me, sitting right there, that Ellison Holdings was worth around $2.3 billion, or that her trust, set up by her father 4 years ago, controlled 41% of it, or that the prenup Derek barely glanced at for 40 minutes was ironclad. She didn't mention any of that because her mother, Vivian, had taught her that you don't use money as a weapon unless you're backed into a corner. And now he had her cornered. I asked her, my voice softer than I felt, how long she thought it had been happening. The texts go back 14 months, she said. 14 months. My mind did the awful math on its own. 14 months ago, they'd just gotten back from celebrating 2 years in Portugal. I remember the sunburn on her shoulders and the blue tile he bought her that still hangs in their hall. That damn tile is still hanging there. Margot, I said, trying to keep my voice even, when did you find out you were pregnant? 13 months ago. I watched her face, trying to school my own into something neutral. So he was already... Yes, she confirmed before I could finish. When I told him about the baby, he was already seeing her. He held me while I cried from being so scared. He said we would figure it all out together. He told her he was the luckiest man in the world. He was already with that woman. The quiet in my kitchen was suddenly suffocating. The refrigerator hummed, a bird hit the window outside, just the normal sounds of a Tuesday that was anything but normal. And then I couldn't hold it back anymore. Honey, I have been biting my tongue for years. She looked straight at me. There were things, small things. I told myself I was reading into it, that it was just Derek's personality. I struggled for a word that wasn't an insult. His energy. What things? She asked. The way he talked down about your job, like it was just a cute hobby. How he'd interrupt you at dinner. The little digs about the house, the car. How he always seemed so shocked when you knew something he didn't. He thought I was being humble, she said. No, I said, my voice low. He thought you were less. There's a world of difference. The truth of that hit her hard. He wasn't missing clues. He just thought there was nothing to miss. We sat with that awful realization. Then I asked the question that was hanging between us. What are you going to do? She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands, her cup, then at me. I'm going to the party, she said. I just stared, confused. Saturday, she clarified. The Rosewood rooftop. 50 guests, Krug champagne, a whole tasting menu for some woman named Cassandra who's turning 30. Margot, I started. He has no idea that I know, she said, cutting me off. And I want to keep it that way for one more week. Why? She finally picked up her cold coffee and took a sip. Because some things, she said, her voice steely, need to be handled in front of an audience. Before she left, with her hand on the door and the August heat pressing in, she asked me for one more thing. Can I borrow that black dress, the Giovanni, with the empire waist? I just looked at her. Yes. Margot, that dress cost a... I know what it cost, she cut in. I'm the one who told you to buy it. I watched her drive away, the 22 minutes it would take her to get home. I thought about all the things I hadn't said, all the moments I stayed quiet. I remembered when she first brought Derek to meet her mother, Vivian, at the garden house, which was basically an 11-room mansion. Vivian was so polite, asking all the right questions about his job and his intentions. But later, she had turned to Margot and said, so simply, he doesn't know, does he? It wasn't a question. No, Margot told her. When will you tell him? When I know he loves me for me. I remember Margot telling me about her mother's look, the one that saw everything. That's not wisdom, Margot, she'd said. That's fear? You know the difference. Yes, Margot had answered. I do. She always meant to tell him. There was a plan. After a year, after they'd built a real foundation, after she was sure. But 1 year turned into 2, and then a wedding with a prenup I now understood was more like a fortress. The secret just became a part of her life, a wall she couldn't tear down. She never lied to him, not really. She just never offered the whole truth. Was that so wrong? For 3 years, I watched her wrestle with that. I saw how people changed when they found out about the money. They looked at her like she was a prize to be won. But Derek just looked at her like she was a person. A stubborn, wonderful, normal person. She needed that so badly. But now, I see the terrible irony. By trying to be just a person, she let him become a man who thought he was her savior. He thought he married a woman who needed him, who depended on him. I watched her car just sit in the driveway for 6 minutes. Through the open garage door, I could see his golf clubs and old paint cans from the renovation I helped her with 2 years ago. She paid for it all, but he got to pick the finishes. It seemed fair back then. Now it seems like a symbol for their whole marriage. She finally went inside. He wouldn't be home until 7. She had hours. She went to her home office, the one he patronizingly called her art room, like she was a child with a playroom. My fists clenched just thinking about it. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and made a video call to Russell, the man from the 38th floor of some Manhattan tower, where libraries and law firms have tasteful children. I pictured his mentor's mahogany desk and the 2 chairs that were always empty. He was 62, but looked 55. The Ellison family's chief legal officer for 23 years. He knew her father. I imagined him looking at her through the screen, seeing her father's strength, and maybe worrying about it too. "Tell me what happened," he would have said, and she would have. He'd listen with that marble-like calm she described. When she was done, he would ask, "How far along are you now?" 31 weeks. "And the prenup," she'd say. "I need to know what he gets." "I know what event," Russell would say, already pulling a file, so thick it was clear he was always prepared. The short answer is very little. Your father was incredibly thorough. The trust is separate. Your premarital assets are untouchable. The marital estate, what you built together, is all that gets divided. So what was the marital estate? The house, a few joint accounts he used for show, a car, some furniture. What was it all worth? About $1.2 million? She'd put down the deposit and paid for the renovations herself. I pieced it all together later. In the worst-case scenario, the one where a judge felt sorry for him, he'd leave with maybe $200,000 or $300,000 and a car. I looked at the photo on his desk again. He had paid $40,000 for a watch she bought him. Its current value was something I'm sure he checked constantly. And the trust? He didn't know. He couldn't know. I looked at the email I'd sent one more time. He signed a prenuptial agreement that he did not read carefully. My anonymous tip was just a footnote. But it was a footnote he would never see coming. I remember the first time I knew something was wrong. He had no warmth for her anymore, no real connection in his eyes. He had no right to her inheritance or her family's legacy, but he was taking something far more precious. The only thing he seemed to own was the space she willingly gave him, and I watched from my window as that space grew smaller and smaller. She seemed to shrink with it. Then this week, a sharp-suited man named Russell started visiting. I overheard her one afternoon, her voice tight. "I need 1 week. For the party. I want to go to the party." I saw Russell just stare at her. She continued, her voice gaining a steely edge. "He threw a party on a rooftop for his mistress while his pregnant wife was home. I won't let that just slide." A heavy silence hung between them, the kind I imagine men like him use to weigh consequences. "Should I worry?" he asked. "No," she replied, her gaze distant. "I won't make a scene. I want him to truly see me. One last time. I want him to know what he's losing." I watched Russell nod slowly, considering her words. Should I set anything up? he asked. Yes, she said, her voice firm. I saw a courier deliver a thick portfolio the next day, full of what I guessed were public documents about Ellison Holdings, press releases, old articles, board announcements, everything. I wondered why. Then it hit me. He's going to look her up, she must have thought, and I want him to find something. Later, I overheard Russell on the phone in her driveway, his voice a low rumble of strategy. Margot, he was saying, are you aware the Rosewood rooftop is owned by a group the Ellison Trust has a 43% stake in? I saw her stop dead still among her roses. In practice, he went on, Derek rented a party space in a building your family basically owns. You have the power to cancel the whole thing. She stood there for a long time, the silence stretching. I don't want to cancel it, she finally said, and I saw Russell almost crack a smile. I figured you wouldn't, he said. I want to be there, she declared. The rest of the afternoon, she sat on her porch, making a list, not of what she'd lost, but of what she was about to do. She was, as her father probably would have said, setting the board. She was playing a part, and I was her unwilling audience. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Margot performed her role as a wife with the precision of a master, but the heart was gone. I could smell the rich garlic and basil from the pasta she made Wednesday, a sauce that took 40 minutes. Derek got home at 7:30, ate 2 plates, told her it was great, and asked about her day with an emptiness that felt colder than silence. He was there, but he was a million miles away. On Thursday, she asked him pointed questions about his work, forcing him to give real answers. I watched his face through the window as he spoke, and I saw on hers the deep, profound weariness of someone who has pretended for so long that genuine comfort feels like a foreign language. On Friday morning, I saw her drive to her 31-week appointment by herself. I knew Dr. Caroline Merritt, a calm, kind woman who made you feel heard. I imagined her pressing that cold ultrasound wand to Margot's stomach, the screen showing a perfect, healthy baby. A strong heartbeat, the right size, everything just as it should be. I pictured Margot on that table, watching her daughter's heart flicker on the monitor, feeling something that wasn't sorrow or joy, but a third, unnamed thing growing inside her. She drove home. I saw her tell Derek the news later that day. She said the baby was perfect. Her heart was strong. Everything was fine. He just said, "Great, great." While scrolling on his phone, I watched his empty expression and felt a burn of anger for her. He never once asked about the baby's name. They had agreed on it months ago, Eleanor. He helped pick it, then filed it away like a completed task, not a new life about to begin. She caught herself staring into space, and I saw her physically shake it off. The breakdown could come later. For now, she had work to do. On Thursday night, Derek had gone out for work drinks, coming home by 11. He smelled of expensive whiskey and a restaurant I didn't recognize, even from the street. She was already upstairs, the light from her reading lamp spilling onto the lawn when he pulled in. She pretended to be asleep. The pretense had become second nature to her months ago, without me even noticing the shift. After his breathing evened out beside her, she must have lain there in the dark, letting the full weight of it all settle on her. Not the rage, not yet. That was building. I could see it in the clench of her jaw during the day, a storm gathering force. But that night, she must have let the sadness come first. The grief for the marriage she thought she had, for the man she once loved, for all the years she had made herself smaller, quieter, thinking that was what love demanded. It wasn't love, it was damage control. After Derek was asleep Thursday night, Margot came back downstairs. I saw the lights flick on. What happened next was a mystery to me then, but I saw a woman who could no longer be still. The house was asleep, but she was painfully awake. She started cleaning, scouring the entire first floor with the frantic energy of a person who, unable to fix the big things, declares war on the small ones. She wiped counters, she rearranged the pantry, and then I saw her, 7 months pregnant, get down on her hands and knees with a toothbrush to clean the grout in the kitchen tiles. It was 11 o'clock at night. It was madness, I knew that, but she couldn't stop. When there was nothing left to scrub, she went upstairs. I saw the bathroom light go on. She must have run a bath, not because she wanted one, but because the cleaning had drained everything from her, and there was nothing else to do. She didn't even change. She just sat on the edge of the tub in her jeans and an old sweatshirt, her feet in the warm water, just sitting there. The bathroom tiles were a pale green. I remember when she picked them, driving 40 minutes to a specialty shop and spending hours choosing that exact shade. She had loved them. I imagine her thinking, I'm going to miss these tiles. And that was the thing that finally made her finally break. Not the party, not the 14 months of secret texts, not the playlist with 47 songs, not the thought of Derek's hand on another woman's back. Those things would have their turn, but the tiles, the pale green tiles she had chosen with such love for a home she'd built with a man she'd trusted. She cried for the tiles. She cried for everything they stood for. She cried hard and quietly, the way you learn to in a boarding school with thin walls. Then she dried her eyes, drained the tub, and went back to her bed. As for Cassandra Whitmore, because she deserves a mention, I saw Margot on her laptop Wednesday afternoon, her face grim. She was digging, using skills a man like Russell must have taught her. Cassandra Whitmore, 29, from Columbus, Ohio. A marketing director at a rival real estate firm. Not Derek's, but one just like it. It started at a conference, I think. Or maybe just through work. I saw him with her the first time at a client lunch. I looked her up later, saw the polished Instagram with its perfect travel shots and family photos. She had a master's from a good school, and in every picture she looked genuinely happy. Not like some home wrecker from a bad movie. That was the part that got to me. I wanted it to be simple, for her to be some obvious villain, so I wouldn't have to feel so conflicted. But she looked real. She looked like someone who maybe didn't know the whole story, or maybe she knew and just told herself this was different. Either way, it made me feel sick. It wasn't about her, though. It was about Derek and how he'd put all of us in a position where we had to know about her at all. My silence started that day, a quiet complicity I couldn't shake. I knew what I was seeing, and I knew it wasn't an accident. A man can stumble into a mistake. Derek wasn't stumbling, he was building, with precision. He was constructing this other life, brick by brick, right next to the one he had with Margot. I saw it at the office every day for 14 months. The hushed phone calls, the client dinners that ran late, the texts I'd catch a glimpse of about someone deserving the world. It wasn't a slip-up. It was a second parallel existence. On Thursday, I saw him leaving work early, said he was heading home for dinner with Margot. He put on that face, the one he wore when he was playing the part of the good husband, probably feeling a little guilty and trying to overcompensate. I'd seen him do it before, that focused attention that was all part of the act. He was performing his life with her, and I was one of the few people who knew it was all a lie, a carefully managed illusion, just waiting for the curtain to fall. On Friday, I overheard him telling Graham about a client thing on Saturday night. Big event, he'd said, casual as anything. Margot won't want to come. All business. He was so smooth, so practiced in the lie, he probably didn't even see it as a performance anymore. He didn't even break a sweat. He looked relieved. That was the moment something in me snapped. Hearing him describe the party, Cassandra's birthday party I knew, as something to spare his pregnant wife from. The injustice of it was a physical thing. All my quiet regret turned into energy, a need to do something. I couldn't let him walk into that party, celebrate his other life, while Margot was at home, alone and deceived. My anger needed a direction. I found the event invitation online, the one he thought was so private. I knew what I had to do. I was done being a silent partner to his deceit. I had to tell her. Not with my name attached, just a push in the right direction. My heart pounded as I created the anonymous email account. It felt both terrifying and necessary. I couldn't let her walk into that alone. I sent a simple message with the time and place. A few minutes later, another thought struck me. I called a contact I had at the Rosewood, a guy who owed me a favor. I told him a guest of mine, a Mrs. Margot Ellison, would be arriving, and to ensure she had no trouble at the door. "She's expected," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. After I hung up, a wave of something like pride washed over me. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was directing the energy, just like her father would have wanted. I was making sure she wouldn't be alone when the truth finally came out. The rooftop of the Rosewood was exactly as opulent as you'd expect. String lights, the city skyline glowing amber and violet, everything designed to look beautiful and effortless. I saw the white linen tables, the bartenders pouring expensive champagne, the massive floral wall that must have cost a fortune. I'd been in these rooms, with these people, for years, but tonight it all felt different, fragile. About 50 guests were already there when she walked in. I saw her immediately. I had made sure she wouldn't be on a list, that she wouldn't have to explain herself. The call I made ensured she could just walk in like she belonged there, because she did, more than anyone. I stayed near the bar, watching, my own gut twisting. I had set the stage. Now I just had to let the players find their places. I nursed a sparkling water and a champagne flute, trying to blend in near the edge of the rooftop. From there, I could see everything. It only took about 3 minutes. There was Derek, standing by that ridiculous flower wall, talking with Graham Whitfield, our partner. He was laughing. He wore a new suit, one I'd never seen before, and he looked lighter. That's the only word for it. It was the look of a man who has set down a heavy burden, and in that instant, I knew with sickening certainty that the burden was Margot. His life with her, his coming child, that was the weight. This party, and all it represented, this was his relief. It wasn't about work stress. He wasn't escaping the anxiety of becoming a father. He was escaping her. He was relieved to be away from the woman I knew he was supposed to love. The feeling of being a burden is a terrible thing to realize you've placed on someone. I watched him, and my guilt felt heavy as stone. Then Cassandra arrived. She came up the stairs in a stunning red dress, laughing, and the whole party shifted its gravity toward her, the way rooms do. Derek turned, and the look on his face. I'll never forget it. It wasn't just desire, it was profound relief, like a man who'd been underwater and could finally breathe. He looked at Cassandra Whitmore like she was the prize at the end of a long, hard race, the thing that made every lie, every risk, completely worth it. I had to admit, she was beautiful. A simple fact of the landscape, but the way he looked at her, confirmed every terrible thought I'd had. He saw her as his reward, and Margot, his pregnant wife, had become the cost. Derek moved to Cassandra's side, a kiss on the cheek, his hand finding the small of her back like it had 1,000 times before. It was so natural, so possessive. As they stood there, the perfect couple, I saw Graham Whitfield's eyes scan the crowd, and then he saw her. I watched the sequence of emotions play across his face. Confusion, then the shock of recognition, then the absolute dawning horror of a man who knows he's standing at ground zero of an explosion. He understood immediately what was about to happen. He mumbled something to Derek and made a beeline for Margot. "Margot?" I heard him say, his voice strained. I watched him try to manage the situation, to steer her away, but she just stood her ground, calm and pleasant. He was trying to stop the inevitable, but it was already too late. I had made sure of that. Graham retreated, defeated, and went straight to Derek. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Derek's face as he listened. I watched his entire demeanor shift, the calculations starting, the two lives he'd kept separate suddenly colliding in the same space. He went completely still for a second, a man realizing the walls have just come down. Then, to his credit, he moved towards her. He didn't hesitate. I watched him arrange his expression into one of surprised delight as he walked. "Margot," he said, the performance of his life, "what are you doing here?" And I watched her look him right in the eye. She glanced around the rooftop, at the party that was not for a client, at the woman in the red dress, and then back at him. My part was over. I had opened the door, and now, finally, the truth could walk through it. I remember the moment I saw her walk in, and my blood ran cold. The jasmine, the string lights, the $18,000 lie of it all. I knew whose party it was, and my stomach twisted. I saw Derek's face freeze, that subtle tick in his jaw I'd seen 100 times before a carefully constructed lie. He called it a work thing, a client event. I heard her ask the name, her voice so calm it was chilling. Then, the silence. I held my breath from across the terrace, watching, knowing. When she said his name, Derek, without a tremor, I swear the whole rooftop felt it. It was a perfect, terrible moment. He was caught. We were all caught. He took her arm, pulling her toward the elevators, his mask of a charming host crumbling into something I recognized all too well. Raw fear. Underneath the fear, I saw something else in his face, a flicker of relief. The weight of the secret was finally being lifted, even if it was about to crush him. "I can explain," he'd probably started. I knew the whole story. I'd seen the texts on his unlocked phone at the office months ago. The vestibule doors closed, but I knew what was being said. Cassandra. 14 months. Telling her she deserved the world. I remembered seeing him buy the birthday gift, claiming it was for his mother. The lie felt suffocating, even from 50 feet away. Our daughter is 7 months along. That part I didn't know, and the thought of it made me feel sick. He deserved the way the blood drained from his face. Sorry is too small a word. Complicated is just an excuse for cowards. And I knew, standing there, that I was one too. When he said, "I love you," I had to turn away. I couldn't watch. When she walked back out onto that rooftop alone, her composure was the most brutal condemnation I had ever witnessed. "My attorney will contact yours." I imagined her saying it just like that. Quiet, final. I watched her go back to the party, her party now, in a way. She asked the bartender for sparkling water, and I felt a pang of shame so sharp it almost buckled my knees. She sat at a table by the railing, overlooking the entire city, pregnant, betrayed, and sitting at her husband's, Mistress's, 30th birthday party. The sheer, terrifying strength of it, that kind of calm, I knew, was the stillness before a tidal wave. She wasn't leaving. She was claiming the ground he had forfeited, and I was just another guest at the scene of the crime. I did nothing. For 43 seconds, maybe more, I just stood there. I should have walked out. I should have feigned illness. Instead, I let 20 minutes pass, nursing a drink I didn't want, before I finally forced my legs to move toward her. Derek never came back, of course. He'd fled. I approached her table like a man walking to his own execution. I had rehearsed a whole speech in my head, but it all felt like ash in my mouth. I just sat down. I told her I didn't know, not for a long time. It was a half-truth, the worst kind of lie. But eventually you did, she said, and her voice wasn't angry, just factual. It was worse than anger. Yes, I admitted. The word felt like poison. I had failed a basic test of human decency, and we both knew it. I wanted to tell her I was sorry, but what good would that do? My silence had made me complicit. I understand the position, she said, and the grace in that statement was a physical blow. She knew I was a coward, and she was letting me off the hook. I nodded, miserable and grateful. I left her table and went straight to the bar. That's when I saw Cassandra start asking questions. She'd seen Derek leave in a hurry. She'd seen me talking to the solitary pregnant woman in the corner. Her face was a mask of confusion. She came to me, demanding answers, and I knew my night had just gotten exponentially worse. I was the keeper of a secret that had just blown up the room. I gave her just enough of the truth to make her stop. Not the details, just the fact that the story wasn't what she thought. I watched her face as the fantasy crumbled. The beautiful party, the perfect man, it all dissolved into something ugly. And a part of me, the part I hate, felt a grim satisfaction. I couldn't feel sorry for her. Not then. A moment later, a woman walked in who commanded the space without saying a word. She moved straight to Margot's table. It was her mother, Vivian. She sat, took one look at her daughter, and the entire atmosphere around that small table shifted. Reinforcements had arrived, and I knew Derek Reeve had no idea what was about to hit him. I watched them from the bar. Vivian took Margot's hand. She didn't say a word. She just sat there, a silent anchor in the middle of a swirling, oblivious party. She didn't offer advice or judgment, just presence. It was the one thing I should have offered, the one thing I failed to do. The toasts were made, the music got louder, and the two of them just sat, holding hands, a quiet island of reality. At 10:30, I saw Margot say she was ready to go. "One day at a time," I heard Vivian say back. It was exactly the right thing. I saw Margot refuse the car service Derek had arranged. She was going to drive herself. She needed the solitude. I needed a drink. I went home close to 11, but the nursery in my own house felt haunted. I kept picturing her, sitting in a dark room, meant for 3, now meant for 2. I imagined her trying to piece together a future from the wreckage I had watched being made. I had kept quiet for so long, to keep my job, to not make waves, to stay out of it. And for what? So a good woman could be humiliated? The irony was that in trying to protect my own comfortable life, I had helped ruin hers. I thought about the expense reports I'd approved for Derek, the client dinners at hotels, the receipts, the proof. It was all sitting on my laptop. All this time, I had held the facts, and I had done nothing. He chose a version of her. I see that now, the quiet, accommodating one. He never would have chosen the woman I saw tonight, the one with a spine of steel who could face down hell and order a sparkling water. I stayed up until 3 in the morning, the silence of my own home deafening. On Sunday, I saw an email from Derek, a frantic, pathetic plea. By Monday morning, I had made my choice. I opened a new email. I found the name of a senior partner at her family's law firm. There was no subject line. I attached the expense reports, the hotel receipts, the incriminating calendar invites from the last 14 months. I wrote 4 words. He's lying about the timeline. Then I hit send, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. She watered every single one of her plants, 40 minutes of careful, rhythmic work, counting them like rosary beads. It wasn't for prayer, it was for balance, for the steadying rhythm of a simple task done right. On Monday morning, at 10, I saw Russell Hart's car pull away. He had surely just called Derek's lawyer, a man named Philip Crane, and delivered the news in his calm, unshakable voice that Margot was filing for divorce, that the prenup was ironclad, and that the marital assets were far less than Derek imagined, since most of it came from her family's trust. And if he contested, documents about the Ellison family holdings would become very public. Philip Crane probably called back in 45 minutes. Derek had questions. But as I watched Margot get into her car that Saturday, dressed for a battle, my long silence finally ended. I walked across the lawn, not to her, but to her mailbox. I slipped a small, plain envelope inside, containing a single USB drive. On it was footage from my front door camera. The small, courageous act that was my apology for staying quiet for far too long. I remember the day the foundation finally cracked. I was dusting in the hall when I heard her on the phone with Russell, the family's man. Her voice was thin wire when she asked what he had told him about Ellison Holdings. He'd said it was a private trust, and that her husband should have reviewed the prenuptial agreement. I watched her reflection in a framed photo. She was perfectly still. When she asked how he took it, the reply came through the phone. His lawyer needed 24 hours. She said he could have them and hung up. She sat at her desk, staring out at the September light, so different from August, colder, less forgiving. At 2:15, a call came from an unknown number. She almost let it go. She has a strange superstition about those. But after 31 years, she still hadn't reasoned her way out of it. She answered. I saw her whole body stiffen at the voice of Cassandra Whitmore. "Don't hang up," she said after a long moment. I couldn't hear the other woman, only the effect of her words. An apology was being delivered, the only reason for the call. "Okay," was all my employer said. I could see the story building on her face, the lies her husband had told, that the marriage was over, that they were just working out the details. I imagined the voice on the other end, catching, swearing she would never have, if she'd known there was a baby. I watched a single tear trace a path down her cheek. She believed her. I could see it. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about recognizing they were both caught in the same man's web. She hated it, but she knew the difference between a performance and a reckoning. This was a reckoning. This wasn't a woman calling to defend herself. This was a woman who'd been awake since Saturday night, realizing the man she thought she loved would lie to her just as he'd lied to his wife. That's when my employer's voice changed, became steady. "Did he ever tell you about his finances?" she asked. A pause. Apparently he talked about deals, real estate, and once mentioned his wife's family had money that helped with the house. I watched her absorb this. Did he mention the family name? No. "Tell me what?" she repeated, then cut it short. "Nothing important." She thanked Cassandra, and I could tell she meant it. "Is there anything I can do?" the other woman must have asked. A slow, calculating look crossed her face. "Actually," she said, "there might be." The moment she hung up, she dialed Patrice, sitting before the Diebenkorn painting, the one her father used to stand in front of, without speaking. The afternoon light made it glow. The light seemed to make her glow, too. She told Patrice everything. I pretended to organize a bookshelf nearby. There was a long silence, and then Patrice must have asked if she was just going to absorb all the damage again. "No," she said, her voice like steel. "I'm done absorbing. What are you going to do?" I heard her say she was going to let him, and the whole world, see exactly what he had. She said it into the quiet of the room, as if speaking it to the air would make it true. Somewhere along the way, I made myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. I am done being small. I saw her straighten her shoulders. Tuesday at 3, he came to the house. He'd called first, at least. He wanted to talk, just the two of them. She said yes. I knew it wasn't for his sake. It was because she needed him to understand the full picture. It wasn't about being cruel. It was about showing him the truth of what he'd thrown away. He looked terrible when he showed up, like 2 nights in a hotel had aged him a decade. The calls with Russell and Cassandra had clearly done a number on him. He had the look of a man who'd been doing frantic math in his head and kept getting an answer he couldn't stand. He sat at the kitchen table. "Tell me what you need," he said, his voice holding a tone of surrender I'd never heard before. He'd already done the math. "I need you to understand something first," she began. She told him about when they met, how it was a test for her to see if someone could love her without knowing where she came from. Her father had left her, so she'd never have to worry about money, and all she had ever wanted was to be loved by someone who didn't know that. He sat like a statue. "You passed the test," she told him quietly. For a while. But she was just getting started. She told him that he stopped seeing her, the person, and she just became furniture in his life. And while she was becoming furniture, he found someone who made him feel exceptional again. She even understood that, she said. But the party, that huge, expensive party while she was 7 months pregnant and at home, that was no mistake. It was a choice he'd made every single day for 14 months. For the first time, he didn't argue. The man who could deflect and minimize anything just sat there. "I know," he whispered. "Do you know whose building that rooftop is in?" she asked. He blinked. "The Rosewood?" No, he didn't know. Then she told him. I watched his face as she told him. This was the moment I'd seen her preparing for all week. It wasn't for revenge. It was to make him understand the complete picture of what he'd decided was ordinary and not enough. His face went through a series of expressions I couldn't name as he realized, right there, that the woman he'd treated as a side plot had been the author of the entire story. "How much?" he started. "It doesn't matter," she cut in. "That's what I need you to hear. The number doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm a full person. And I have been living in the margins of my own life because I was afraid to be seen as anything other than just your wife." He finally asked if there was any way to fix it. She took 3 full seconds to consider it. "No," she said. "I don't think so." And I saw not sadness, but a profound sense of peace settle over her. September came, and she moved with the efficiency of a woman who had redirected all her energy from grief into construction. The destruction was done. Now she was building her next life, with the same patient, clear eye she used for acquiring art. The divorce moved quickly. The prenup was ironclad. His attorney sent 3 counterproposals, and Russell rejected each one with a politeness that meant no. In the end, his settlement was his car, personal items, and a lump sum her team generously called generous. He signed without a fight. Patrice later confirmed what I suspected. He had spoken to Cassandra again after that Tuesday. That was where my small, silent part came in. One of his lawyers tried to claim the big Diebenkorn painting as a shared asset. I'd been polishing the silver in the dining room when I overheard the call. I knew Cassandra must have heard the name Ellison and used Google, showing him the Forbes articles, the foundation, the whole story, the full portrait. She always said it wasn't triumph. Winning would have been a marriage that worked. This was just her landing on her feet, and she knew she was lucky. She knew most women don't have that cushion for the fall. On Wednesday, as the movers came for his things, I did something I should have done a year ago. I found Russell's email. I wrote a short, clear statement. I told him I was there the day her father gave her that painting, 5 years before the wedding, as a 30th birthday gift. It was a small thing, my memory against a lawyer's claim. But after watching in silence for so long, offering the truth was the only thing I could do. It was my turn to help her build. I remember the moving truck. It was a Thursday. I didn't mean to stare from my window, but I did. I was making coffee, and I just watched them haul boxes and furniture out, saw the front door hang open for what felt like hours. That night, I saw her light on in the upstairs bedroom around 2 in the morning. I couldn't see what she was doing, just a silhouette moving back and forth, but I could feel the loneliness from across the street. His side of the driveway was empty, a dark patch of asphalt where his car should have been. It was the first time I noticed how she seemed to fill the whole house on her own, like she was expanding into a space that had suddenly, violently become hers. It was like watching a flower turn toward a sunbeam after being in the shade for far too long. A few days later, I saw an older woman pull up. It was a Thursday morning. She looked like she had spent a lifetime being the kind of woman who knew exactly what she wanted to say and was prepared to say it. I watched them on the porch for a minute. Margot looked calm, resolute. I couldn't hear a word, of course, but you can tell a lot from body language. The older woman seemed to be pleading, her hands moving, her expression intense. I'd been waiting for a scene like that, some sign of the family fallout. I'd rehearsed what I would do, maybe bring over some cookies, but I abandoned the idea. I told myself it wasn't my place. I just watched as the woman finally spoke with what seemed like honesty, her shoulders slumping a bit. I saw Margot give a small nod. I thought, whatever Margot said, it was the right thing. I felt a pang of shame for not checking on her, for not being the one to ask if she needed anything. She deserved people who loved her, and all I was doing was watching from a distance. I saw a courier drop off a thick envelope one afternoon in early September. Margot sat on her front steps to open it. I don't know why I remember that so clearly. She read through the pages with this look on her face, not sad, but maybe, I don't know, tired of being tangled in someone else's story. A friend of hers, Patrice, came over later, and I saw them talking. I imagined Margot saying that she just needed the truth to be official, to be written down somewhere, so she knew she wasn't crazy. It's a terrible feeling, being made to feel complicit in a lie you never even knew was happening. It was just another piece of the mess she was cleaning up by herself. Another detail in a story that she never asked to be in, and I just stood by, another silent spectator. She deserved so much more than that. Not because of the big house or the nice car, but because of the way she held her head high through it all. You could just tell she was the kind of person who deserved someone who saw everything she was, not just the convenient parts. I imagined her telling herself that she would teach her daughter that lesson, to know her own worth from the very beginning so no one could ever make her feel small. Late in September, I saw her drive off in the morning, her belly so full and round against the steering wheel. She came home alone a few hours later. She just sat in her car in the driveway for the longest time, the radio probably playing softly. I saw her at the red light on Riverside sometimes, and I wondered what she was feeling. I bet it was relief, the kind of quiet peace that comes after a storm you always knew was coming finally hits, and you find you're still standing. When the thing that was bound to shatter finally does, and you realize you're still on solid ground. She was still on solid ground. The next time I saw her car was when it was leaving late at night, her friend Patrice at the wheel. The house went dark. A day later, A delivery van left a huge bouquet of white flowers on the porch. I knew then. The baby was here. I felt this strange mix of joy for her and guilt for myself. Her husband wasn't there. I knew that much. This was her moment, and she was choosing to do it her way. I imagined her sending a simple text, "The baby's coming," and then turning her phone off. I pictured her saying, "This day is mine." He had to respect that. And from across the street, in my own quiet house, so did I. Not today. The baby will know you, but today belongs to me. A few days later, they came home. I just caught a glimpse of her carrying the tiny infant seat up the front walk. 8 pounds and 1 ounce of new life. I imagined her holding that baby, feeling a kind of love so real it makes the word itself feel flimsy and small. I'm sure she expected to feel 100 different things, maybe even a shadow of grief for the perfect family picture that was torn up. But I bet she didn't expect to feel so completely whole, as if every step she'd ever taken, through all the heartache and the good times, was leading her straight to that little person. Not the house, not the career, nothing else. Just her daughter. That was the destination all along. She was holding her, and the world outside just faded away. The doctor probably smiled that knowing smile, the one that says, "I've seen this 1,000 times, but for you, it's the first." Later, I saw her mother, Vivian, arrive. Vivian, who always seemed so composed, just stood in the doorway, and I could see her shoulders shaking. She was crying, really crying, the kind of tears that have been held back for far too long. I heard her voice carry across the lawn, just a snippet. "She looks like your father." I saw Margot nod. I could feel the weight of that moment, the beauty and the sadness of it all mixed together. 6 days after the birth, I was in my own kitchen. The morning sun was hitting her house just right, lighting up the window over her sink. It was the same window, the same light, where I'd seen her stand weeks ago, looking so lost, with a phone that wasn't hers and a life that was falling apart. This morning, she was making coffee, one-handed. The baby was strapped to her chest in a carrier, sound asleep. Tiny fists curled by a tiny chin. I remembered the texts I'd imagined on that phone. The 4 words, "You deserve the world." Margot looked down at her daughter, and I could almost hear her whisper, "We're going to be okay." Then, I knew I couldn't just watch anymore. I put on my shoes, walked to her front porch, and left the lasagna I had made with a simple note, "Welcome home, Eleanor. From your neighbor across the street. We're so happy you're here." It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was me, finally, subtracting myself from the list of people who did nothing. I remember seeing the magazine in the checkout line. The woman on the cover was my daughter-in-law, though she wasn't really that anymore. It was a profile on her family's company, a huge philanthropic move, and there she was, holding tiny Eleanor. I saw that photo, her strength, the baby just 3 weeks old, and the guilt hit me like a tidal wave. I had watched my son diminish her for years, had heard the subtle digs and the loud silences, and I never said a word. The article called her the architect of a new vision. It showed her as she was, not as my son had tried to make her, and I finally saw the full scope of what he had thrown away. He had tried to make her just a wife, his wife, a role she accepted, but which was never the whole of her. She was always this other person, this powerhouse, Theo and Vivian's daughter, and now a mother herself. For a time, I think she let my son convince her she was smaller than she was. I know he texted her when the article ran. I can just imagine his words, hollow and self-serving. "I had no idea," he probably wrote. "I'm sorry." As if sorry could stitch back the fabric of a life he so casually tore. I hope she ignored it. I hope she just picked up her baby and closed that chapter for good, knowing she was done letting anyone else define her. She told me once that Eleanor, at only 6 weeks, had so many opinions. About the light, the water, the songs, Margot hummed in the dead of night. She'd speak of it with such wonder, this tiny person who was already so completely herself. She said watching her daughter was more extraordinary than any piece of art or any room full of geniuses she'd ever seen. Then she invited me to Thanksgiving at the big house in Connecticut, her father's house. I was stunned. It was an act of grace I hadn't earned, a quiet statement that she was reclaiming her life and she was letting me be a small part of it. I knew I didn't deserve to go. The house buzzed with life. Vivian was there, of course, and Patrice's family filled the rooms with noise and laughter. I felt like a ghost at the feast, a reminder of the person who was missing. Russell came and went, classic Russell. But then Margot walked over, her face calm, and placed Eleanor in my arms. She just let me hold my granddaughter, right there by the window. I held her for what felt like an eternity, singing some half-remembered lullaby from my son's own childhood, and I tried not to cry. It was a moment suspended in time, a fragile truce I had done nothing to broker. Derek was my son, but his choices were his own. In that moment, Margot let me be Eleanor's grandmother. Nothing more and nothing less. She understood that my love for that child was separate from her own grief, a distinction I was so grateful for. I saw her friend Patrice come to her side, offering a glass of wine. Their heads bent together in quiet conversation. I watched them from across the room, and I saw Margot give a slow, considered nod. She looked tired, but she also looked steady. She was healing, right there in the open, not hiding her scars, but learning to live with them. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I saw her carry Eleanor down the hall toward her father's study. It was the one room she had always avoided, the one that was still too much him. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, into that sanctuary of memory. I stood in the darkened hallway, a silent witness to her quiet courage. That's when I knew I couldn't be silent anymore. I took out my phone and started a message to my son, my fingers trembling slightly. "I saw your daughter today," I wrote. "You have no idea what a beautiful life you chose to walk away from." It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. It was the truth. I remember the day the light went out of her eyes. She was choosing between survival and truth. She made it through. I see that now. The scars are there, but she's on the other side. I'd hear her baby, Eleanor, make that little noise over the phone. The one that said she was safe and loved, completely unaware of the battles her mother fought. I know what Margot held on to, not the bitterness or the quiet rage I saw simmering for months. She let that go. What she kept is a new strength. She knows now that hiding herself was never safety, just fear dressed up as logic. The man who was supposed to value her chose not to. That's a horrible, finished chapter. But what I see in her now is the woman who always finds her feet. And I know she'll spend her whole life making sure her daughter knows she can too. Eleanor's presence on our video calls, a warm, trusting weight on her mother's chest, is proof of that. The cage was never locked. She was just convinced she was too small to see the open door. I saw her drafting a letter to Cassandra. For a week, it sat on her desktop, sent. She'd write, then read it, then minimize the window, then open it again, realizing it wasn't for forgiveness, not for either of them. She reworked it into what it was meant to be, an acknowledgement. Dear Cassandra, we were both blind to different things. You were blind to who I was blind to who he was. I hope you find someone who gives you the whole truth right from the start. I hope you find someone who cherishes you openly, not in secret. You deserve that. So did I. We both still do. She finally sent it. I never asked if she got a reply. I knew it didn't matter. By January, Eleanor was 3 months old, a tiny person with a real personality, so different from those first few weeks. She had a laugh and a serious, judging look for strangers that was so much like Theo, it made Vivian tear up. Margot came back to the office, not fully, but on her own terms. She had the specific confidence of someone working from passion, not necessity. She took on a small acquisitions project, a private collection with major pieces. Exactly her kind of challenge. She met the family's lawyer in a sterile, downtown office one Tuesday. The room had great lighting, terrible coffee, and that old paper smell of places that take themselves too seriously. I watched her outline her strategy, her experience, her gut feelings. She spoke with the authority of a woman who had been mastering her craft for 15 years. When it was over, the lawyer stood and shook her hand. "You're very impressive," he said. "Thank you," Margot replied. And for the first time in forever, it wasn't a performance. It wasn't the practiced humility she'd worn for years. She meant it with the same direct, unapologetic force her father always had. It was simple acceptance. "Thank you. Yes, I know." After, she got into her car, and my phone rang. She'd gotten the acquisition. "I am completely floored," I said immediately, just utterly speechless. "Stop being obnoxious." "I plan on being obnoxious about this forever. It warrants maximum obnoxiousness." I heard her laugh then, a real laugh, not the kind she used to filter for clients or colleagues. It was deep and genuine and came without asking for permission. She drove away from the city. I knew Eleanor was with Vivian, who was probably replacing all the nursery books with her own approved, independently sourced selections. Vivian's principles were legendary. She'd been supporting one tiny Greenwich bookstore for 22 years and wasn't stopping. The January sun hit her windshield, so different from that harsh August gold 7 months ago. The morning I saw her standing frozen in the break room, with a glass of water, her world falling apart on her phone screen. In the 11 minutes it took to read whatever she read, everything had changed. This light was softer, lower in the sky, the kind of light from a season that is sure of itself. It wasn't blinding. It was just right. It was simply light, enough to see the way forward. She pulled into her driveway and just sat there for a second. It wasn't the paralyzed stillness of August, not the inertia of a woman trapped. It was just a pause, a breath between one moment and the next, the beat before you open the door to the life you fought to build. I thought of the woman from 7 months ago, the one I'd worried about so much, with her bare feet and her unsent emails and a secret hurt she carried in her chest. I thought about everything she didn't know then. I thought about what I see in her now. She's a person who lands on her feet. She always was, she just forgot. She let someone else's small-minded view of her dictate how high she could reach. She's through with that now. She's done with shrinking. She's the complete person now. All of it. The ambition, the art, the trust, the pain, the grief, the daughter, the mother, the woman who drove 40 minutes for specific pale green tiles because she knew her own mind. She is all of it, and she is walking back into her life. She went inside. The door shut. I could imagine the scene, Vivian's voice reading from the nursery in that serious tone she uses for books she respects, which is the same tone she uses for everything she respects. A little too grave and therefore deeply sincere. Eleanor would be making her quiet, listening sound. Margot would put her keys on the table and walk toward those voices. Toward her life, Eleanor, Vivian Reeve, grew up feeling cherished. She grew up knowing her name and its history, She grew up in a house with pale green tiles, a small painting of a cornfield, and a grandmother who read to her with profound seriousness. She grew up knowing her mother once stood perfectly still in a kitchen and made a decision. And that decision was her. Watching her story unfold was a lesson, a narrative built with purpose and edited by hardship. It was crafted with a fierce will, offering an emotional truth and a piece of wisdom worth remembering long after the details fade. I'm grateful I was here to see it. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community